That's just an ongoing thing. It expires in about a year, and we'll either let it expire or we'll maybe work out another deal with Mexico and Canada. But look, Mexico and Canada have taken advantage of the United States, like just about every other country, in all fairness. It's not them. I'm not blaming them.
And we just heard some fresh comments from U.S. President Donald Trump about where he stands. The trade agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico is up for review next year.
Donald Trump has once again threatened to blow up the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. But this time, something is different. Canada didn't flinch. While Washington under Trump drifts into uncertainty, from tariff fights to lawsuits to open talk of abandoning major trade frameworks, Canada suddenly looks like the stable anchor of North America. Investors are noticing. Capital is slowly drifting north, supply chains are recalibrating, and Ottawa finds itself with leverage Trump never expected. At a high-profile hearing in Washington, senior U.S. trade officials signaled that President Trump may let CUSMA expire in 2026, or even withdraw unilaterally. Reuters added that the White House is seriously evaluating a year-to-year replacement, or even splitting USMCA into two separate deals, one with Canada, one with Mexico. Trump repeated his familiar line, "We'll either let it expire or work out another deal." Prime Minister Mark Carney, who was in Washington for a FIFA event, did not treat the comment like a crisis. His government simply reiterated that Canada would protect its interests calmly and methodically. Mexico, meanwhile, made clear it wants an early USMCA review to restore investment confidence after a turbulent year, and from Ottawa's perspective, any renegotiation must be trilateral, because a fragmented North America only serves Washington's interests, not its partners. Trump's approach hasn't changed since NAFTA was renegotiated: create uncertainty, push markets to panic, and force trading partners to beg for stability. It worked 8 years ago when Canada was more dependent on U.S. access and less confident on the global stage. But the world of 2025 is not the world of 2017. The U.S. economy is wrestling with inflation, volatile markets, and an internal industrial backlash against open-ended tariffs. Major retailers, including Costco, are openly challenging Trump's tariff authority in U.S. courts. Agricultural exporters are warning about retaliatory pain, and Republican governors privately signal mounting discomfort with another prolonged trade war. In this climate, Trump's threats don't land the way they used to. When he says he can walk away, Canada now understands something critical. Washington no longer projects the stability required to sustain its leverage. The real headline this week was not Trump's threat, but Canada's refusal to react emotionally. Carney's team projected a message that resonated far beyond Ottawa. Canada will not negotiate from fear, and it will not act like a country desperate for American permission. Analysts made the point bluntly. If Canada signals it wants the deal at any cost, it gives up every ounce of bargaining power. The Carney government appears fully aware of this. Canada existed before NAFTA, it survived the Trump trade wars of the past decade, and it continues building export pathways that soften dependence on a single market. More importantly, Canada's modern industrial strategy, from clean energy to critical minerals and AI, now attracts global partners who value predictability over chaos. Trump expected Ottawa to scramble. Instead, he ran into something he rarely encounters: a confident, steady counterpart. A subtle but powerful development is unfolding beneath the surface. Trump's advisors have openly discussed splitting USMCA into two deals so the U.S. becomes the central hub of North American trade. If that happened, any company that wants access to all three markets would have to locate inside the United States. But the past few weeks revealed that Canada and Mexico are far less willing to be separated than Trump imagined. Ottawa and Mexico City now share the same assessment. Trilateralism is essential. Fragmentation benefits only the U.S., while unity restrains Washington's ability to dictate terms. For Trump, this is the least favorable configuration. His entire negotiating playbook relies on isolating counterparties and pressuring them individually. A coordinated Canada-Mexico front blocks that approach and forces Washington to confront a reality it would prefer to ignore. Power in North America is more balanced than it appears. Perhaps the most underestimated factor is that the American public itself is no longer enthusiastic about endless tariff battles. Recent U.S. polling shows strong bipartisan support for preserving CUSMA because it keeps prices stable, protects American manufacturing, and prevents supply chain shocks. Corporate America has grown even more vocal. Manufacturers warn about rising production costs. Farmers fear losing export markets they fought to secure. Retail giants protest that ongoing tariff instability disrupts planning and keeps inflation high. At a moment when American households still struggle with elevated prices, another manufactured trade crisis is the last thing consumers want. The irony is unmistakable. Trump's threat to punish Canada now risks punishing the very voters he needs. And Canada knows that. When Ottawa hears Trump talking about blowing up the deal, it also hears the sound of U.S. political pressure closing in around him. Markets have a simple logic. Money flows towards stability. Trump's America, with its shifting tariffs and legal challenges, no longer offers that stability. Canada, under Carney, increasingly does. Businesses value rule of law environments where policies do not change by tweet or by courtroom drama. They look for governments capable of long-term planning. And they prefer supply chains that are predictable rather than politically explosive. Canada's clean energy tax credits, its industrial strategies for EVs and critical minerals, and its expanding Indo-Pacific partnerships all push in one direction, toward a more resilient economy, less vulnerable to U.S. turbulence. The result is a quiet but unmistakable trend. When Washington becomes unpredictable, Ottawa becomes attractive. What makes this shift even more significant is how foreign investors now talk about Canada. In private briefings, global firms describe the country not just as a safer alternative, but as a strategic hedge against U.S. volatility. They see a government capable of long-term thinking, a workforce aligned with future industries, and a political climate that rewards stability instead of theatrics. In a North America that feels increasingly divided between chaos and consistency, Canada is becoming the rational choice. And once capital begins moving toward stability, it rarely turns back. Trump thought threatening CUSMA would place Canada back on its heels. Instead, it revealed how much the landscape has changed. Canada is not the junior partner it once was. Mexico is no longer isolated. And the U.S. political climate, fractured, inflation-sensitive, and weary of tariff wars, now weakens Trump's leverage more than it strengthens it. If Washington continues down this path, North America may not be shaped by Trump's dominance, but by Canada's stability. The choice facing investors is becoming clearer: a volatile United States or a steady Canada building long-term partnerships. The real question is this: in a continent now defined by uncertainty on one side and confidence on the other, which future will businesses, workers, and global markets choose? The answer may already be forming.
Miles, we've heard from Canadians who are boycotting travel to the U.S., and that's really costing the United States. This, of course, tied to the souring relationship with the United States because U.S. President Donald Trump launched a trade war, has also been referring to Canada as the 51st state, which
Prime Minister Mark Carney did not expect this wave of national unity, and frankly, neither did anyone watching the Canada-US relationship this year. New travel data from Statistics Canada shows something unprecedented. Canadians are rejecting Donald Trump's America with a clarity that feels almost historic. Travel to the United States hasn't simply softened, it has collapsed. Border crossings have emptied out, weekend trips have evaporated, and entire American towns that once relied on Canadian shoppers are suddenly going quiet. For a country often accused of being too polite, this is one of the loudest messages Canadians have sent in years. And the message is unmistakable. Canada doesn't bow to Trump. Canada chooses Canada.
Inbound international tourism is not simply a nice to have for the US economy. It's a meaningful export of services, it's a driver of jobs, and a contributor to the trade balance.
The newest Statistics Canada report, released this week, paints a picture that stunned even longtime analysts. Air travel from Canada to the U.S. in October plunged by nearly a quarter compared to last year. Land crossings did even worse, falling by more than 30%. The drop isn't a single-month anomaly. It has been building since early in Trump's second term, accelerating each time new tariffs or new insults were fired across the border. A scene that's become increasingly common. Border lanes more open than usual, foot traffic almost eerily light, and businesses on the Detroit side adjusting their expectations downward. According to interviews conducted by CBC and Global News, many Canadians simply feel unwanted, or worse, disrespected, after months of Trump calling Canada the 51st state and launching a new series of protectionist tariffs that hit steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, and agriculture. On the American side, the economic consequences are becoming impossible to ignore. A recent U.S. Travel Association estimate suggests the U.S. will see a sharp decline in international visits this year, losing billions in spending, with Canadians representing the largest share of that missing demand. Restaurant owners in places like Detroit say weekends feel flatter. Hotels in Buffalo report fewer reservations, and tourism boards from Seattle to upstate New York are scrambling to launch special promotions targeted specifically at Canadians. Yet, despite discounted hotel packages, cross-border coupons, and We Miss Canadians marketing campaigns, the numbers aren't rebounding. Canadians appear to be making a statement, and they're sticking to it. There is something deeper happening beneath the travel statistics. For decades, visiting the United States was practically a reflex. A routine weekend getaway, a quick shopping trip, a hockey tournament across the border, or a spontaneous night in Seattle or Detroit. But Trump's second term has reshaped the emotional landscape of cross-border life. His tariffs, his rhetoric, and his casual treatment of allies have stirred something that Canadians rarely express openly: a desire to stand apart and stand tall. Mark Carney has been insisting for months that Canada must strengthen its independence, diversify its markets, and stop assuming that Washington will always behave like a partner. His government's moves toward Asia, the active diplomacy at APEC in South Korea, and his emphasis on rebuilding Canadian industry all point toward a new, more self-confident national direction. But even he did not anticipate how quickly Canadians themselves would begin reflecting that mindset. This moment is not Ottawa telling Canadians to be more self-reliant. It's Canadians telling Ottawa they're already there. Trump has always believed tariffs are a one-way pressure tool, something Washington uses to squeeze others until they comply. What he rarely acknowledges is that economic pressure flows both ways, and tourism is one of the most powerful pressure points of all. Canadians are traditionally the largest group of foreign visitors to the U.S., and their spending supports hotels, restaurants, sports venues, outlet malls, and entertainment districts across multiple states. When Canadians stay home, the impact is immediate. Detroit's waterfront restaurants feel the absence on weekend nights. Buffalo's shopping districts lose the familiar Ontario crowd. And even Seattle tourism boards admit they've ramped up targeted We Miss Canadians campaigns to reverse the trend. These gestures may be friendly, but they reveal a deeper anxiety. Canadian visitors are not optional for border economies. They are essential. Canada has spent decades absorbing U.S. decisions. Now, without protests or political theater, Canadians are quietly demonstrating that influence runs in both directions, and that Trump, for once, is not the only one applying pressure. For Carney, who has spent much of his first year navigating an unpredictable U.S. administration, this travel shift is a political tailwind. It reinforces much of what he has been arguing. that Canada must build resilience, invest in its own industries, and reduce reliance on the U.S. when American politics becomes unstable. The fact that Canadians themselves are acting on that logic makes his message stronger, not because he instructed them to, but because ordinary people independently reached the same conclusion. What has changed is the balance of sentiment. Canadians no longer accept being treated as an afterthought or a bargaining chip, and that shift gives Carney more room to maneuver. When Trump demands concessions on autos, steel, or energy, Carney can point to the unmistakable reaction back home. A leader pushing back is one thing. A whole population quietly adjusting its behavior is far more powerful, and Washington knows it. Analysts say next year's FIFA World Cup, partly hosted in the United States, might bring some Canadians back across the border, as could America's upcoming 250th anniversary celebrations. But even optimistic forecasters are cautious. Travel patterns can bounce back, but sentiment is harder to shift. Once people feel their dignity has been slighted, trust doesn't automatically return. If Trump continues escalating tariffs on Canadian goods, something Reuters reports is likely in early 2026, the emotional distance between Canadians and the U.S. could deepen even further. And while Canada will always share geography and history with the U.S., identity is something much more powerful. Canadians are discovering theirs again. This isn't a simple travel story. It is a story about national pride, economic power, and the re-emergence of a Canadian confidence that refuses to bend to political storms south of the border. In turning away from Trump's America, Canadians are turning toward themselves, toward a sense of autonomy that doesn't need permission or approval. Carney may be stunned by how quickly this shift happened. Trump may be startled by the economic consequences. But the real headline is this: Canada is done being taken for granted. And now the question remains, if Canadians can walk away from Trump's U.S. this decisively, what part of the old Canada-U.S. relationship will they reshape next?
There is the President of the United States and the President of South Korea. We know President Trump certainly loves gold, and that is quite a gift that he is being gifted right now by the people of South Korea at this big summit.
Wherever Donald Trump travels, the spotlight follows. And this week, the world watched him arrive in South Korea for the APEC summit, only to see something unexpected. Seoul didn't challenge him with confrontation. Instead, it greeted him with a performance of flattery so calculated that it bordered on satire. Before APEC even began, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney had already thrown a punch of his own in Malaysia, calling for maturity and independence in global trade. Two leaders, two continents, and two very different ways of handling America's unpredictable president. This is the story of how South Korea turned diplomacy into theater, and how Canada turned patience into power. In the city of Gyeongju, the South Korean government staged a welcome unlike any other. Cameras flashed as Trump was presented with a gold-plated crown necklace and seated for a banquet carefully designed to play to his ego. The main course? American-style beef patties with ketchup, his favorite condiment. It seemed humorous at first, but this wasn't just about dinner. Behind the ceremony was a sophisticated act of statecraft. Trump had been demanding that Seoul pay as much as $350 billion in upfront contributions or face new 25% tariffs. The Korean side refused. After days of negotiations, the final arrangement reportedly cut the tariff threat to 15%, while South Korea agreed to make targeted investments. No blank checks, only projects with shared control and profit. In essence, Korea paid with symbolism instead of cash. Trump got the applause he craved, Seoul got a balanced deal, and the world witnessed a masterclass in how to tame an unpredictable negotiator without losing face. The real genius of Seoul's approach lay in the details. The gold necklace appealed to Trump's image of grandeur. The hamburger and ketchup played to his New York sensibilities. Then came the dessert, an orange-shaped confection nicknamed the Peacemaker. Observers saw it for what it was, a diplomatic wink. By giving Trump every theatrical cue of victory, Seoul made sure he walked away content. But in substance, the agreement kept South Korea's economic autonomy intact. Each gesture was psychological strategy disguised as hospitality. Gold represented recognition, ketchup, familiarity, and the orange dessert, a gentle mockery of Trump's persona. It was both humor and control, a reminder that soft power can outmaneuver hard demands. By the end of the evening, Trump declared that the deal was virtually done. For Seoul, it was already a quiet whim. For everyone watching, it was proof that diplomacy in 2025 required a mix of charm, calculation, and humor.
As APEC's official sessions began, Trump once again dominated the cameras, but not the agenda. Surrounded by leaders from across Asia and the Pacific, he found himself praised publicly, yet bypassed privately. While Trump highlighted his so-called tariff victories, South Korea, Japan, and ASEAN states spent their meetings strengthening trade frameworks that excluded the United States. These included ongoing technology and supply chain initiatives, first launched during the 2023 ASEAN Economic Framework. The optics were striking. Trump at the center of ceremonies while the rest of the region quietly coordinated economic policies around him. The America First strategy that once commanded fear now drew polite smiles and cautious distance. In 2025, Asia's economies are expected to account for nearly 60% of global growth, according to the IMF's World Economic Outlook. That makes cooperation within the region far more valuable than appeasing Washington's demands. South Korea understood this. Its treatment of Trump wasn't just about humor, it was a signal that Asia could manage its relationships with or without the United States.
Just days before the APEC summit in Kuala Lumpur, Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered what many analysts are calling a defining speech for Canada's modern trade policy. Standing before Southeast Asian leaders, he laid out a plan to double Canada's non-US exports over the next decade, an expansion worth roughly $300 billion in new trade. The figures were not slogans. Ottawa had already concluded or advanced multiple deals in 2025, an investment and energy framework with the European Union in August, a critical minerals partnership with Germany, agricultural and manufacturing accords with Mexico and Ecuador, and, most recently, Canada's first bilateral free trade agreement with Indonesia, announced in September. In Malaysia, Carney confirmed that talks with the broader ASEAN bloc are expected to conclude next year. Canada also signed a letter of intent with Malaysia's Petronas to expand the LNG Canada project in Kitimat, British Columbia, one of the world's largest liquefied natural gas facilities. Phase 2 alone could create tens of thousands of jobs, according to federal estimates. Carney's message was simple but profound. Canada's growth no longer depends on waiting for Washington's approval. The country will build its own network across Asia and Europe, based on stable partnerships and shared prosperity.
While Carney spoke abroad, Ontario Premier Doug Ford was dealing with Trump's outrage at home. Ford's provincial government had funded an advertisement in the U.S. that replayed a 1987 speech by Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs. The ad aired during the World Series and went viral, reaching more than 11 billion online impressions, according to Canadian media analytics. Trump's reaction was swift. A new 10% tariff on Canadian goods announced mid-flight to Asia. Yet Ford refused to escalate. He simply restated that tariffs hurt both sides, that every dollar taxed on a Canadian product raises costs for American consumers. Carney also chose silence, focusing instead on trade diversification and domestic investment. This contrast, Trump's fury versus Canada's composure, spoke louder than any statement. In diplomatic terms, calm became a weapon. For American audiences, the message landed. Public polls in late October by Ipsos Canada found that more than 60% of Canadians and 52% of Americans now believe tariffs between the two countries do more harm than good. Canada's restraint was paying off in public opinion as well as policy.
Two continents told one story this week. In Asia, South Korea showed how to handle Trump with elegance and irony, feeding his pride while defending its own interests. In Southeast Asia, Canada demonstrated the next stage of Western diplomacy: independence without hostility, strategy without drama. Together, these moments reveal a changing world order. The United States remains powerful, but its allies have learned to navigate it rather than follow it. Soft power, patience, and long-term planning are replacing fear and flattery as the tools of modern leadership. At APEC 2025, Trump wore gold, accepted applause, and claimed victory, but the real winners were those who smiled back and quietly shaped the future. South Korea secured its trade balance. Canada secured its economic direction. And perhaps the clearest lesson from this week is that the rest of the world has finally adapted to the Trump era, not by confronting it, but by outsmarting it.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is headed back to Washington for his second high-stakes Oval Office meeting. The last one was cordial.
Canada's a very special place to me.
We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada. I think Canada could be one where they'll just pay tariff.
Will the Prime Minister have better luck this time, and what happens if he can't secure any trade relief?
It is another cool October morning in Washington, and the familiar motorcade pulls up once again at the gates of the White House. For Prime Minister Mark Carney, this second visit carries a very different weight from the first. Back in May, when he met President Donald Trump for the first time, the tone was polite. Cameras captured handshakes and talk of friendship. But 5 months later, the atmosphere has changed. Since that first meeting, the United States has expanded tariffs on Canadian goods, increasing pressure on industries that once depended on the open flow of trade across the world's longest border. Canada's steel and aluminum now face heavy duties. Lumber producers are paying as much as 45% on shipments to the U.S. The pain is visible in places like British Columbia, where hundreds of mill workers have already lost their jobs. Before this visit, Carney's team worked for weeks to reopen discussions on metals and forestry. In both Ottawa and Washington, negotiators have been exploring a possible adjustment to the tariffs. Optimism is cautious but real, not about removing all duties, but about reaching a point where trade can resume under more predictable rules. As Carney steps into the Oval Office again, the goal is modest but meaningful, to show that patience can be stronger than pressure. The tension between Washington and Ottawa has become a test of endurance rather than confrontation. Both economies are too intertwined to hurt each other without feeling the blow themselves. The United States is Canada's top customer for metals and forest products, while Canada provides nearly 1/5 of America's imported construction materials. Every new tariff ricochets through that shared supply chain. Trump's latest duties on steel, aluminum, and lumber have done more than raise trade numbers. They have changed the cost of daily life. Official U.S. data show that the average price of Canadian lumber entering the American market is now nearly 50% higher than a year ago. Industry estimates suggest the increase adds between $9,000 and $11,000 to the cost of a single new home. In states already struggling with affordable housing and wildfire recovery, that spike is devastating. Canadian producers are struggling in parallel. Companies that once shipped 90% of their output south have been forced to cut staff and idle production lines. Many report paying hundreds of millions of dollars in duties since 2017 and reducing their workforces by more than half to stay afloat. The fallout has been especially severe across northern British Columbia, where smaller secondary manufacturers are disappearing altogether. In both countries, the tariff war has stopped being a political slogan. It has become an expensive reminder that walls in trade rarely stand on just one side. The trade conflict soon became a political one. In Canada, Carney's leadership has been under scrutiny. Critics accuse him of failing to secure results while American tariffs on Canadian goods continue to climb. Yet Ottawa has stuck to a deliberate strategy, maintaining credit ratings, supporting vulnerable industries, and avoiding retaliation that could worsen the standoff. The aim is to preserve stability while allowing time for U.S. industries to feel the pressure from rising costs. That pressure is now visible.
In the United States, parts of the government remain shut down after a budget stalemate. Inflation is still elevated. Construction and manufacturing firms are paying more for imported materials. Trump's promise that tariffs would strengthen domestic production has not materialized. Instead, companies face higher costs and tighter margins. Governors from industrial states like Michigan and Pennsylvania have publicly voiced concern over layoffs and supply disruptions. Business groups that once supported Trump's trade stance are now asking for predictability instead of punishment. Amid this shift, Carney's trip to Washington is no longer framed as a diplomatic courtesy, but as a stress test of Trump's economic agenda. The tariffs intended to make Canada yield are now exposing the weaknesses of America's own economy.
As the October 7 meeting approaches, both governments are preparing for a narrow window of progress. The discussions are focused on stabilizing or lowering duties on steel and aluminum. Even a partial agreement could signal that the two countries are ready to pull back from escalation. If Washington agrees to minor tariff relief, it will be a recognition that the costs have become too high to ignore. Canada's measured and diplomatic posture contrasts sharply with Trump's confrontational approach. In Ottawa, attention is already turning to the 2026 review of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Carney's team aims to enter that process from a position of credibility, one built on persistence rather than political theater. Avoiding rash concessions today helps preserve leverage for tomorrow. Meanwhile, economic pressure in the U.S. is mounting. Builders warn of delayed housing projects, farmers face higher input costs, and retailers report rising prices for household goods. What began as an assertion of economic strength now looks increasingly like a policy of self-inflicted strain. If Carney succeeds in achieving even limited progress, it would not only bring short-term relief to Canadian industries, but also mark a turning point in perception. It would show that a smaller nation can withstand economic coercion, and that endurance can sometimes be the most powerful negotiation tool.
Trade policy is rarely about numbers alone. It is about pride and perception. Trump built his economic image on the idea that tariffs equal strength. But in a global economy, true strength comes from cooperation. When one side isolates itself, both sides pay. For Canada, the past year has been a harsh lesson in patience. Factories have cut shifts, and workers in resource towns have faced uncertainty. Yet the government has avoided escalation, betting that restraint would outlast aggression. That patience is now showing results. In the U.S., business leaders and voters are increasingly seeing tariffs not as protection, but as taxes on their own livelihoods. Trump's effort to weaponize trade has exposed its limits. It has hurt allies more than rivals, raised domestic costs, and highlighted the fragility of American supply chains. Canada, meanwhile, has used the moment to diversify, expanding trade with Europe and Asia, supporting local refining projects, and investing in cleaner industrial capacity. As Carney's motorcade leaves Ottawa for Washington, the stakes are clear. This meeting is not only about metals, it is about whether cooperation can outlast confrontation. The trade war that began as a test of loyalty has turned into a test of endurance. Trump once believed that tariffs would make America rich. Instead, they have made the cost of power visible. For Canada, that realization may be the quiet victory it needed. The confrontation meant to weaken the country has only strengthened its resolve. And when Carney sits once again in the Oval Office, he will not come as a supplicant, but as a partner reminding the United States that shared prosperity, not rivalry, is the foundation of true strength.